the last asylum keeper who housed a giant, what she said in Old Tartarian Before Dying, 1898. In the winter of 1898, a woman named Hedvika Solnar died in a stone building on the outskirts of Brno, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She was 73 years old. She had kept a private asylum for 41 years. She had no children, no surviving husband, and no known relatives alive. What she had, according to the single surviving account of her death, was a final conversation. A conversation that the attending physician recorded in a private journal, a journal that was never submitted to any medical archive, never published, and never explained. The physician wrote that Hedvika spoke for approximately 20 minutes before she died. He wrote that he did not understand the language she spoke in. He wrote that it was not Czech, not German, not Latin, not Hungarian. He wrote that it sounded, in his words, like something older than any of those. He wrote 4 words that no one in the official record ever followed up on. He wrote, "She was not alone." That line ends the entry there. The journal resurfaced in 2009 in a Prague estate sale. The person who bought it has never been publicly identified. What we know about what came before that final night, who Hedvika Solnar was, what she kept inside that asylum, and why the language she died speaking has been quietly cross-referenced with fragments of what researchers now call Old Tartarian, is a story that official history has not told you. And it begins not in 1898, but in a civilization that most people have never been allowed to consider. If this is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, subscribe before we go any further. Hit the notification bell, because this channel exists for what the record leaves out. The Tartarian Empire, if you accept the evidence that revisionist historians have been assembling for the past 2 decades, was not a fringe empire. It was not a footnote. According to the 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Tartary was described as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west. It is listed as one of the largest territories on the known map of the world. It had subcategories: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. This was not mythology. This was cartography. And then, somewhere between the late 18th century and the middle of the 19th, Tartary vanished from the maps. Not gradually, not peacefully. It was edited out. The empire, its governance structures, its architectural tradition, its recorded language, its cities, was absorbed into the expanding narratives of Russia, China, and British imperial geography, and the word itself was reclassified as an ethnic slur, referring to nomadic peoples, stripping it of its political and civilizational identity in a single historiographical move. Researchers who study the physical remnants of what they call the Tartarian world point to a specific category of architecture: the massive public buildings found across North America, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and parts of Australia. Buildings that appear in photographs from the mid to late 1800s, already centuries old, with no construction records, no named architects, no dated foundations, and no reliable explanation for how they were built, with the labour force and materials supposedly available at the time. The theory that has grown around this physical evidence is called the mud flood hypothesis. The idea is that a civilization-ending event, possibly a coordinated reset, buried the ground floors and lower structures of these buildings beneath a uniform layer of earth sometime in the early 19th century, and the populations that inherited the above ground remained simply moved in, renamed them, and wrote history as though they had built them. The economic implications of this theory are profound, because what it suggests is not just a lost civilization, it suggests a stolen one. A civilization whose infrastructure, whose accumulated resources, whose institutional knowledge, and whose human population were absorbed by the powers that replaced it, without credit, without acknowledgement, and without record. It is in this context that Hedvika Solnar becomes significant. The asylum she kept was called, in the administrative records of the Brno district, simply the house on the Morava Road. It appears in local tax records beginning in 1857. It is listed as a private residential care facility. The building it occupied was not constructed in 1857. The tax records themselves note that the structure was already present on the land when the license was issued. No construction date is recorded. The building is described in those same records as having foundation stones of unusual depth and a ground floor that sat, in the words of the district assessor, below the level of the surrounding road. This is a detail that mud flood researchers have flagged in dozens of similar structures across Central Europe. The surrounding road being higher than the building's ground floor is not a quirk of design. It is evidence of a ground level that shifted. Hedvika did not create the asylum. She inherited the management of it from a man named Otakar Pivek, who had operated it since at least 1843 and who, before his death in 1857, kept no public records of his residence. What Hedvika did, unusually, was keep private records. She maintained a set of handwritten ledgers, written in a mix of Czech and a second language that the two scholars who examined the Prague journal in 2011 described as exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with any documented Central European language of the period. The ledgers themselves have not been made publicly available. They were apparently included in the estate sale, purchased with the journal, and have not surfaced since. What we know about the contents of those ledgers comes from a single source, a footnote in a privately circulated paper written in 2013 by a retired philologist based in Vienna. The philologist, who published under a pseudonym, wrote that the ledgers contained intake records for 17 residents over a period of 4 decades, that most of the records were routine and that one was not. The entry that was not routine was for a resident admitted in 1861 and listed as deceased in 1897, 1 year before Hedvika herself died. The entry described the resident's physical dimensions in a way that the philologist called clinically straightforward but contextually extraordinary. The resident was listed at a height of 2 meters and 91 centimeters, just under 10 feet. The record noted that the resident was ambulatory, that he was not violent, that he ate approximately 4 times the quantity of food consumed by the facility's other residents, and that he spoke, in the words of Hedvika's ledger, in a tongue I recognized from the stones of the lower room. The lower room. In a building where the ground floor already sat below road level. A lower room means a sub-ground level, a room below the room that was already underground. The philologist's paper does not speculate beyond what the ledger recorded. But the phrase Hedvika used, a tongue I recognize from the stones, has been interpreted by researchers working in the Tartarian space as a direct reference to inscriptions, specifically to the type of carved or pressed linguistic markings that have been documented on the lower stonework of buildings across Central Europe, in basements and foundations that predate their above-ground structures by what researchers estimate to be centuries. These markings have been photographed, catalogued, and compared. They do not correspond to Latin, Cyrillic, Greek, or any recognized ancient script. Some researchers have proposed that they represent a functional written language of the Tartarian world, an administrative or archival script used by the civilization that built these structures and that was then buried, along with the structures themselves, when the reset occurred. Hedvika Solnar, if the ledger is authentic, grew up looking at those stones. She was the daughter of Otakar Pivek's housekeeper and had lived in the building since childhood. She would have seen those lower room markings her entire life. And the man she cared for from 1861 to 1897, the man who stood nearly 3 meters tall, the man who ate 4 times what anyone else ate, spoke in a way she connected to those carvings. The economic dimension of this is the part that revisionist historians find most significant and most deliberately suppressed. The Tartarian Empire, as it appears in pre-19th century cartography and in the architectural record, was not a primitive civilization. The buildings attributed to it, the grand train stations, the cathedrals, the civic halls, the hospitals and asylums, represent an infrastructure investment of staggering scale. In any honest economic accounting, those structures represent wealth, generational compounded civilizational wealth embedded in stone and mortar and municipal planning, and not just architectural wealth. The Tartarian world, according to researchers who have reconstructed its trade routes from surviving pre-reset maps, operated a continent-spanning economic system. Free energy researchers point to the towers, the domed civic buildings, the copper-clad rooftops visible in daguerreotypes of cities that claim to have been frontier settlements built in a decade. They argue that what appears to be decorative architecture is in fact functional infrastructure, receivers and distributors of an energy grid that the civilization that replaced Tartary, dismantled and then denied, had ever existed. The suppression is economic in the most direct sense. It is about who gets to charge for power. When that civilization was reset, when the mud came or the war came or whatever mechanism of erasure came, that wealth did not disappear. It was inherited. The powers that stepped into the Tartarian world inherited trillions in any modern equivalent of pre-built infrastructure. They claimed it, they named it, they taxed it, and they wrote the history that said they had built it. This is not just a historical curiosity. This is the largest undocumented wealth transfer in human history. And the people who know about it, the scholars, the archivists, the keepers of small private institutions in buildings with sub-ground floors and carved stones in their lower rooms, have consistently across generations disappeared from the record. Hedvika Solna is one of the few who left a trace. And that trace is a physician's journal, a footnote in a pseudonymous philological paper, and 4 words in a private record that no public institution has ever formally acknowledged. She was not alone. What did she say in Old Tartarian before she died? The physician did not transcribe it. He noted that he could not. He was not a linguist, and the sounds he wrote did not resolve into letters he could assign with confidence. What he did record was his impression of the content based on her gestures and her effect. He wrote that she appeared to be describing a location, that she used her hands in a way consistent with indicating distance and depth, that she repeated what sounded like the same phrase 3 times, and that in the final moments she pointed downward, not at the floor of the room she was in, at the floor beneath it. The building on the Morava Road was demolished in 1931. The demolition records describe it as structurally compromised. No photographs of the interior survive in public archives. No record of what was found in the lower room, or whether the lower room was ever excavated, exists in any accessible municipal file. The site is now a parking facility. The giant who lived in that building for 36 years was buried, according to Hedvika's ledger, in a plot behind the property. That plot is also now part of the parking facility. No grave marker was ever recorded in the Brno district burial registry. The man with no official name, no documented origin, no death certificate filed with any civil authority, who spoke in a tongue carved into pre-civilizational stone, and was cared for by a woman who spent 40 years learning to understand him, does not exist in the historical record. But Hedvika wrote him down, and somewhere in a private collection in a city that has never been named, her ledgers still exist. 41 years of intake records, written in 2 languages, one of which the world has been told does not exist. If you believe the official history, this is a strange curiosity. A dying woman, an unusually tall patient, a physician who wrote something odd in a journal he never submitted. If you understand what the Tartarian researchers have been documenting for 20 years, the buildings, the maps, the reset, the stolen infrastructure, the suppressed language, then what Hedvika Solna did in that stone building for 4 decades looks like something else entirely. It looks like preservation. It looks like one woman in a buried room in a city that had already forgotten what it stood on, keeping the last living speaker of a dead civilization alive for 36 years. And when he died, she kept his language alive in her. And when she died, she tried one final time to say it out loud, to a physician who did not understand. In a room above a room where the words were already written in the walls, the record ends there. But records, as this channel has shown before, are not the same thing as truth. They are what was allowed to survive. Everything else is still in the ground. Leave a comment with what you think she was pointing at. Share this video with someone who asks the questions the textbooks won't. And if you are new here, subscribe. Because this is where the buried history gets unburied.